Hello and welcome everybody to another edition of the Saturdays for the Byzantines podcast. My name is Professor Wren. I am your host. If you are finding this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Google Play, please make sure to give us a follow, and if you can, leave us a 5-star review. So today, I wanted to take a minute to talk to you guys about monasticism, or the development of monasteries and the rules of monks who lived in monasteries. This is an important development for a number of reasons. It's a cultural development, it's a religious development, obviously, and it's an intellectual development in the history of Western civilization, and really starts to come up. It starts coming up well before the time period we're at with Justinian, but I wanted to take a minute to kind of rewind a little bit and talk about this, because like I said, it's very interesting and it's very important, because understand that as time goes on, especially in the West, as well as in the East, various intellectual trends, works of literature, works of philosophy, certainly works of history, are both produced and preserved in monasteries. So this is very important. This is what preserves ancient philosophers like Aristotle, for example, get preserved in monasteries as well. Also, as time goes on, especially with Charlemagne in the West, you get the development of universities, right? Because and this is in no small part because in the time period that we're talking about, very few people are literate. Very few people can read and write. And the people who can read and write are usually religious, either priests of the secular variety. And when I say a secular priest, I'm talking about like a diocesan priest, a priest who was a parish, as well as bishops. And then as well, priests and monks who are in orders. For example, as will come up at the end of the 6th century, are the Benedictines, formed by Saint Benedict himself, and he comes up with his rule, the rule of Saint Benedict, by which all the Benedictine monks live, and many orders which will follow a similar rule to the one that Saint Benedict came up with. So I want to go over a little bit of the history of where does monasticism come from. Now, it really sparks in the 4th century. It has a hallmark, or a kind of raison d'etre of regular prayer. You have offices, which is a regular schedule of prayer. So like you wake up in the morning and you go to, sorry, I don't know all the names. There's like matins and various other names for the times of the day at which the monks go and pray. I don't know these off the top of my head, but usually it's like, you wake up in the morning and you go and pray, and then like at midday there's prayers, and kind of in the afternoon, and then around dinner time, and then before you go to bed. And then actually a number of them will wake up kind of in the middle of the night to do prayers at like 3 in the morning or something, and pray for an hour and go back to bed. That's pretty common. It's also important to remember, as I kind of said earlier, the health of monasticism equals the health of Catholic and Orthodox culture, because these things in whether it's Catholic or Orthodox, really Western Christian culture, are preserved in monasteries. Again, we're talking about works of literature, works of history, because a lot of monks are going to be writing chronicles as well, and this is history. That's a preservation of your history, writing down whether it's day-to-day events or just major events that happen over the course of somebody's lifetime. Now, I have in my notes here that I'm reading out of my notebook from college. It says there's no real reason why it became popular. It just did. I don't think this is, I think this is probably not the case, because I mentioned earlier, monasticism sparks in the 4th century. Now, this is also when Christianity becomes legalized or tolerated, or whatever word you want to use. People sometimes argue about what exact term you're using here. But Christianity becomes tolerated during the 4th century. Edict of Milan, Emperor Constantine, all of these things occur in the 4th century. And we had talked about earlier in this series, when we did kind of our who is, the various church fathers, that was all those guys started coming up in the 4th century, and that is in no small part due to the fact that Christianity has become legalized and tolerated in the Roman Empire, and now the chains are broken off it, and there's more of a flourishing. In the 4th century, monks start to take their place beside bishops in church leadership positions. Right, so bishops are generally the ones who are in the hierarchy of the church. They're the princes of the church, so to speak. They're the leaders. And in the 4th century, you begin to see monks also rise to these positions of leadership as well, especially abbots. If you're the abbot of an abbey, that's a very high-ranking position. You're the guy in charge of an abbey or a monastery. I guess abbey is more for nuns. And actually, it is said that the monks, especially the abbots, provide a more reliable spiritual guidance than the bishops. This seems to be because there's less distractions around for monks, right? They're kind of out in the middle of the wilderness. They're away from civilization and all of the things that can distract you with that. And so the monks can be a little more focused on especially spiritual guidance, which is what they're often sought out for. Now, monasticism, it also originates in Egypt and starts with hermits. Now, these were guys who sought the solitude of the desert, but kind of spoiling their own best plans. Oftentimes, they ended up finding each other out in the desert, because when you're out in the desert, you need water. There's not that many sources of water in the desert. And so all of these hermits are going to gravitate around these sources of water, and they're going to end up near each other anyway, kind of ending up in a situation which they initially wanted to avoid. And then there were also people, right, because they're out in the middle of the desert, there also need to be people who come bring them food, because there's a little secret here, there's no food in the desert, okay? And so people need to come bring the monks food. And sometimes you might also hear about guys who are called ascetics. Now I should make sure I'm saying this right. Ascetics, not aesthetics, as in like something is aesthetically pleasing. We're talking about ascetics as in a very harsh, strict way of living. Typically, ascetic has a religious association with it. You're casting away the niceties of life, nice clothes, good food, alcohol, these kinds of things, in order to kind of offer up that suffering to God, basically. Now, these guys came, the hermits out in the desert became somewhat of spiritual celebrities. People would sometimes bring their sick children to them in the desert to heal them. And depending, I mean, there are certain stories like there in college, and perhaps I'll do a little reading out of this. If I might not have the book. I'm going to have to check to see if I have the book here with me or if I left it at home. But there's a guy called Simon Stylites, who was he was a hermit. We'll talk about him here. What kind of monk he was in a minute. He was known as a pole sitter. And you might ask, well, what is a pole sitter? Well, the name is pretty self-explanatory. They just sat on top of a pole. And people would come to these pole sitters for like advice and healing and all that kind of stuff. And there's a couple of accounts of the life of Simon Stylites which describe these sorts of things. Now, we should keep in mind, asceticism was not meant for everybody. It was a kind of grace God only extended to certain groups of people. It's kind of a special calling. Not everybody can go off and live a secluded lifestyle, whether it's in the desert by yourself or in a community of guys, which we'll talk about here in a second. And you kind of forego worldly, like I said, worldly niceties. Not everyone's going to be called to that. Not everyone's going to want to do that. Now, one of the most important figures in the foundation of monasticism is going to be Saint Anthony of Egypt. Now, he lived and advocated for what was called an eremitical life. This comes from the Greek eremos, which meant desert, so basically like desert life, living in the desert. And the Eremitics were more of, they sought out a more secluded lifestyle. So contrary to the group we're going to talk about here in a minute, they didn't want to live in community with other guys. They didn't want anyone else around. They wanted to be by themselves. And like I said, this is different from another guy, Saint Pachomius, who founded an early monastery, and his monastic trend was known as the cenobites. Now, cenobites, contrary to the Eremites, were they lived in community. They were not. They didn't live secluded with each other. These were the guys who would go out in the desert, and there's one watering hole out in the middle of the desert, and they find that, oh well, 30 guys have also showed up here with the same idea that I had, right? Because again, you need water, and there's not that much of it. So they figured, well, we might as well live together and kind of help each other out. Now, interestingly, there was a question that came up here. Does monasticism prevent one from loving one's neighbors and therefore contradict the gospel, right? Because obviously one of the major messages that Jesus brings in the gospel is to love your neighbor as yourself, right? Kind of a revolutionary idea. And St. Basil the Great, the Cappadocian father, who we talked about earlier, you can go back and listen to our episode lecture on the Cappadocian fathers. Pretty good, if I do say so myself. But St. Basil says, no, that monasticism does not prevent one from loving one's neighbor. But specifically here, he's talking about the cenobites' life, which makes sense because these guys are living in community, and so they're helping each other out. They're sharing chores with each other, cooking food. Eventually, as monasteries form and these become more established and not just a bunch of guys hanging out in the desert, and there's like buildings and that kind of thing, you know, they're going to share various jobs and chores, and this is a way that they live the gospel of loving their neighbor because they're helping out all the guys they're living with. And now, like I said before, one kind of eremitical lifestyle were the stylites. And the stylites would live near towns. They were exposed to more kinds of weather, obviously, because like I said, they would sit on top of a pole and basically spend their days praying. And if people came to them for spiritual advice or healing, they would do that as well. And as with a lot of these things, people would come bring them food. Someone would have to, you know, send them a chamber pot, so to speak. And I'll just leave it at that. And like I said, one of the more famous of the stylites was Simon Stylite. There's, like I said, in a future episode, I'll go digging through my books here and try to see if I can find it, and I can reference it for you guys if anyone's interested in a little light reading. Now, these monks, they were distinguished for their spiritual zeal, but not quite so much their intellect. So they don't produce a lot of literature. Now, as time goes on, this is obviously going to change. You're going to have lots of monks who are going to write, you know, spiritual treatises, like I said, histories, poetry, spiritual commentaries, biblical commentaries, all these sorts of things. But initially, they're not producing as much literature as they will as time goes on. The cenobites do have some intellectual interest, which mostly revolve around writing about being a monk. And then as well, you get John Cassian. Now, Cassian is another guy who is involved in developing monasticism and spreading monasticism. said that cenobites were to work to provide for themselves, emphasized a cultivation of virtue, I mean, kind of obviously. And the one thing that Cassian is really one of the important things that he does is he's going to help bring monasticism to the West. I believe he actually goes all the way to Ireland at one point. I have in my notes here that he settled in Marseille, or at least what is now called Marseille. I think back then, probably more likely call it Massalia. But that happens in about 415, and this is going to help bring monasticism to the West and spread monasticism to the West, and it's going to have a great influence on guys like Saint Benedict, who John Cassian did have a good amount of writing. However, it was very long and difficult to read. And one of the many things that Saint Benedict does is he breaks down Cassian's books so that they're easier to read and digest and that sort of thing. And again, one of the main points I want to emphasize here, so I moved the microphone, sorry for the sound there, but one of the most important things about the monasteries, well, two important things is that they preserve culture, right? They preserve the Western culture. They're also going to help civilize the barbarians in the West, right? The Goths, both the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, the Franks especially, are going to be civilized in large part by the church and by monasteries. They're going to impart aspects of old Roman culture, the Latin language, Catholic Christianity. All of those things are going to come to the barbarians through the church and especially through monasteries. And then, as well, like I said, monasteries are going to be the places where universities first develop, which are not just places where culture is preserved, but also created. And I lost my train of thought. I don't know what I was about to say, but that's really all I wanted to come on here and talk to you guys about. So again, that's been our video on monasticism here. If you've made it this far in the lecture, please make sure to give us a like on YouTube, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or any other podcast platform, please make sure to give us a follow, and if you can, leave us a 5-star review as well. It really helps the show. We are also on Facebook and Instagram. If you search Professor Wren, you can find us there, where I will post updates about the show, as well as any, sometimes, really it's it's a good amount of memes. Sometimes I find historical memes that I think are fun and amusing, and I want to share them with you guys because I think, hopefully you find them amusing as well. And so with that, I will see y'all next time.